Welcome to the podcast at the Diplomacy Next, and I'm being joined by my guest for the today's podcast. She is a research, and she's a fellow at the Manohar Parikar Institute for Defense and Study Analysis, and apart from that, she also is writing quite regularly on the developments in the geopolitical discourse in Europe and across the world, and most importantly, why. Uh, People who are watching who will be watching this podcast and have subscribed to our channel is that this will help you understand the geopolitical setting of the world from the realistic perspective. And all the guests that I am inviting time and again, they all belong to either academics or the policy making or policy analysis. And I reckon that this is the important thing that I contribute and that my guests contribute to the entire literature of international relations. Apart from that, I would like to welcome Swasti Rao again on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Miraj, and thanks for a kind introduction. And let me also congratulate you. And we were just talking before the podcast started that there are very few programs and platforms which really are put together to help the IR students understand these issues better in a way that we would probably take up in a classroom. Okay, trying to lay all the different threads of a different of different topics, etc. So yeah, let me congratulate you for that. And yes, I think you have a very steady audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this compliment. So let's rush into the session. That's important thing because we have seen time and again that there is something or the other that's happening in Europe apart from Russia-Ukraine war that's taking place in the Europe itself. And first of all, I'd like you to begin with this thing that recent Macron's visit to China and how what has it changed the developments in the European Union just draws a larger landscape. There are questions, there are arguments that are being made. We'll just do a follow up with that. Just draws first a larger landscape that the entire thing. How has it happened and what does it signify for the students for the academicians to look into.
Right. Fine, Miraj. So let's start with this. And like you said, that Macron, Emmanuel Macron is France's president and a very popular world leader, not just a popular European leader. And he made a visit to China, and for some reason, the visit really became extremely controversial. Now, this also becomes controversial because few months before Macron went to China, another heavyweight European leader, Olaf Scholz, who's the Chancellor of Germany, had gone to China, and he had gone to China, and even that trip was criticized for some reasons, but it did not become as controversial as Macron's trip became. So the question is, what happened? Did it change anything? Why did Macron have to do it? Okay, etc. So let's just first understand the background of it. The background is that Europe is undergoing a massive transformation, and this particular transformation, this particular crisis, is definitely precipitated by the war in Ukraine because I'm sure later we'll talk about it, so I'm not elaborating much on that right away, is that Europe was, after the Second World War and the way they put together their institutions, they had actually been counting on this fact that perhaps there would never be any war because, of this entire experiment of the European Union coming together, which is a very, very successful model of interstate, economic integration. And they had outsourced their security and hard security problems to NATO and the US. And, they had thought that the kind of a arrangement that they have made with buying cheap oil and gas from Russia, and all the combatants prior combatants of the First World War, Second World War, now living together happily. Of course, there were problems and skirmishes, but then nothing to the degree of a war, okay, of a conventional war particularly. So what the Ukraine war has done is the Ukraine war has completely shredded that political and geopolitical, geoeconomic, and security architecture to pieces. And it is in this backdrop that you are seeing. I'm sure everybody knows that European Union has come together to support Ukraine, and the idea is that Ukraine is now fighting not only for their security, but Ukraine is actually fighting for Europe's security because in Europe, the sentiment is that this is not a standalone war. So the war has started not in 2022, but actually there is a discernible pattern in Russia's behavior after 2008, which is the first war which happened in Georgia, etc., etc. Now, I just want to, just touch upon this because it gives a bit of a background as to what is happening. So, of course, there are more things to discuss, because obviously then it all starts from 1991 and how the security guarantees were given and how there was an assurance coming from the West about NATO not being moving eastward, etc. So we can get into it if you want, but I think these are things which are really well known by now. What I want to focus on is that the backdrop is that Europe has rallied together behind Ukraine, and the sentiment which is held up, at least politically and formally, is that Ukraine is, like I said, not fighting only for its own security, but Ukraine is actually fighting for Europe's security, because 2008 there was a war, 2014 there was a Crimean War, 2022 there's a Ukraine war, full-fledged, and if it is not going to stop, next would be Moldova or later. So that is the sentiment, and for that sentiment to gain leverage, I think the idea of solidarity is extremely important. And Macron is a major player, because if you see the European experiment, Mehraj, the EU experiment particularly, so there are two countries, or leaders of two countries that really provide that fundamental stewardship to that experiment. And of course, it is a Franco-German, I'd say, project. So European Union, though it has 27 countries, but it is by and large a Franco-German project. So the statements, the policies of France and Germany and their leaders is something which is what the European Union has been all about. Okay. And it is in that context that Macron went to China. And when he went to China, of course, he went to China with the European Union President Ursula von der Leyen. And I'll tell you more about that. But when he went to China, he kind of struck certain notes which were not seen as conducive to European solidarity and unity. Now, you'll ask me, what exactly did he say? Actually, he did not say anything extremely tangible, but the problem was that he said things like, Europe's strategic autonomy, Europe's quest, France's quest for, strategic autonomy. He said that we don't like war, we don't really share, America's sentiment for war, etc. So, and all of this came at a time, you have to understand the context, because obviously this is something that the Chinese want to hear. Chinese would like the European Union to remain divided. The Chinese have been playing this game of dividing Europe in their own way. I'll tell you more about it later, but, the Chinese are known to divide, the current geopolitics. They've been dividing the ASEAN countries. They've divided, say, for example, the African countries, and, so like that. So Chinese wanted to hear that, and these statements made by Macron were taken in a very positive light in China. Obviously, it created a furor in Europe, because European leaders and policymakers were very quick to come and say that, wait a minute, these things do not reflect that there is some sort of a wedge between different countries, or there is some sort of an independent approach that France has towards Taiwan, etc. So those were the things. This is just a basic background of what had happened. At the heart of that particular visit was to try and have more trade with China, because if you notice, whether it was Scholz who went to China in November 2022, or whether it's Macron who's been there recently, they are always accompanied by a huge contingent of major business heads and executives, etc. And the idea is always to try and have better trade relations, because the first thing that everybody needs to know when it comes to Europe and China is that Europe and China are each other's, one of the biggest trading partners. So Europe has massive trade with China, China has massive trade with Europe. And under the present circumstances, the problem is that China is seen as a major player in the world that that is basically indirectly, directly supporting Russia in this war against Ukraine. And this is something which is extremely difficult for the Europeans to digest, because ideally they wanted China, being their major trading partner, they wanted China to play a more visible role in bringing the conflict to its conflict to an end, or at least to de-escalate the conflict in a meaningful enough way. That never happened, and so that was the frustration that Europe generally has with China's, I would say, hand in glove approach towards supporting Russia in many indirect ways, and at the same time saying that, oh, we are your trading partners too. So the problem before Europe is, if I cut a long story short, the problem before Europe is that they want to have a unified policy towards, trying to tailor the trade that the two sides have in a way which doesn't really affect these security issues. And Europe is coming up with certain ways. I'll tell you about that as well. But the problem again was that, here is a person who is so important, European solidarity, who's seen upon as one of the major, I would say, leaders in this entire European Union project. And suddenly he goes to China at a time when the war is on, etc., etc. The US leaks have happened, and there is a lot of vulnerability in the world about, is Europe really united? Okay, those kind of things are already making rounds, and suddenly you see somebody as important as Emmanuel Macron going there and just taking a very discordant note and saying that it almost, it was interpreted in a way that Europe is trying to go completely solo. Okay, sorry, Macron is trying to go completely solo. So, but then when you look into it deeper, you realize that actually very little changed actually. And by and large, Macron's own policies, as in the policies that France has internally, are, and even the ones that are as latest as April 2023, which is that just days before he embarked upon the trip to Beijing, all those policies are basically underscoring the importance of transatlantic ties, the importance of deepening relations with NATO, etc., etc. So again, I mean, why all the song and dance for nothing? So as we'll talk further, I'll tell you that it is not for nothing. It definitely has a message, but I think what needs to be done is that it needs to be understood in a better way. So you want, I can continue with it, or you can ask me a question so that I can take it more directly.
There are many questions, and I have recently come across different write-ups where they argue that policymakers in the US have not taken this Macron's visit to China, and then the statement he made about larger European strategic autonomy. And that having been said, if we dissect it a bit more, you were talking about the solidarity in the amongst the states in the Europe, and the strategic autonomy debate. I also came across something called that Europe is trying to leverage its commercial power, because and some people would argue that it's not Macron for the first time he has made a statement like this. He also has made a statement back in 2019 where he said that NATO is suffering the brain death. And that having been said, is Europe trying to leverage its commercial strength in order to have a larger say in the global affairs, not to get into this bipolarity, or the China US trade war, or for that matter anything else? Even some people will go to an extent and say that, okay, Europe without US pressure or without US alignment can go solo on its own, and that emerging defense industry that's coming up there will on its own try to deal with the rising China and the Chinese aggression and the Chinese trade practices that they have their own laws they have framed in order to protect their markets. So what do you make of this entire thing, that the solidarity and the strategic autonomy debate, and you rightly mentioned that there have been heads of the states who have visited China earlier. Even Italian Prime Minister is planning to visit China this May.
Right.
And this entire thing is just coming up. Significant developments are taking place in Europe and its geopolitics. What do you make of this commercial strength of the Europe for the larger picture of this debate?
Yes. So the first thing is that European Union is a massive trade bloc in the world, which has been unable to convert its geo-economic strength into any geopolitical traction. And it would like to take its decision on its own, but it doesn't have the ability. Now, why does it not have the ability? Because, like I said, that the European experiment was that you outsource the hard security issues to the NATO, and you have put into place this very smooth and very efficient system of mutual trade, which is going to keep you running, okay, because everybody is happy, everybody is more prosperous. So it's just that very classic neoliberal understanding that if you have a healthy kicking trade, why would you go to war? Okay. And it is this particular neoliberal logic that the Europeans thought was enough to bind them together. Since this was shredded to pieces by the war, is why Europe is suddenly in this existential crisis, because they realize that fine. And all these statements that you referred to, Mehraj, about Macron saying that NATO is brain dead, etc., I will come to that. But all of that came before the war. And one of the things that I can tell you for sure is that nobody in Europe believed that there would be war, least of all people from Germany and France, because let's understand that this entire system of trying to put together trade as priority with Russia, because of all these pipelines that are running from Russia to Europe, and how everybody was benefiting out of this, and the entire Nord Stream project, etc., etc. So all these things were basically put together, like I said, by the European Union. And who in the European Union? So European Union is a group of 27 countries, but not all 27 countries have the same traction, right? I mean, there are heavyweights there. So France and Germany and Italy are the heavyweights, and within the three, it's definitely France and Germany. So nobody in Europe wanted to, agree, or nobody in Europe wanted to believe that there could actually be a war, no matter how many times U.S. intelligence said that, because US intelligence was having its own game, which is that after 2014, after the Crimean annexation, they were training the Ukrainians, there were CIA projects running there. So they had a different, I would say, a very piercing understanding of what the security situation in East Europe is like. But regardless of what the US security and intelligence, the inputs given by the intelligence of, US, France and Germany didn't want that. And one of the evidences that I can give you about it is that there is something called the Normandy format talks, Mehraj. Okay, and the Normandy format talks are very important because Normandy format talks is a diplomatic multilateral forum where Russia and Ukraine, it is in fact the only multilateral forum where Russia and Ukraine come and talk directly with each other. And who are the ones that facilitated it is France and Germany. So the Normandy format talks have 4 participants: France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. Okay. And the Normandy format talks have been, in a way, from Europe's perspective, from France's perspective, from Germany's perspective, and I'm talking about the Merkel era, and you know how important Angela Merkel as a leader was before she stepped down in 2021. So what I'm trying to say is that Normandy format talk meetings were happening almost very, very frequently just before the war started. And what was the purpose? The purpose was that let's try to solve this, a buildup of tensions through diplomatic channels. And the people who were at the forefront of this diplomatic dialogue was Emmanuel Macron. Okay, if you remember the number of trips that Emmanuel Macron made to, to Russia, and if you remember, those were COVID times, and he was sitting in that really long, table where President Putin used to, welcome his guests. So he made all those trips, and he was the one who was trying to call and trying to find out some diplomatic solution, because it was a core belief in the European, I would say, leadership back then, is that why would there be a war? I mean, the sentiment was that basically President Putin only wants respect, and we want President Putin against China. I mean, if you remember, there was just 1 month before the war broke out here at IDSA, I only coordinated this visit by the chief of the naval staff of Germany, and he was here. It is available on YouTube, and your viewers can go and take a look at it. And he was here, and he made very strange statements, which of course later he had to resign from his post about. But the crux of the argument that he was trying to say was that basically there will be no war in Europe because war is in nobody's interests. And we have a thriving economy, we have thriving economic structures, we have the Nord Stream 1 ready, the Nord Stream 1 is running, the Nord Stream 2 is ready. I mean, why would anybody, just throw all of that out of the window and get into a war, which is not really a rational war, okay, in many sense, because whatever else you want from your geopolitical decisions, okay, or from your geopolitical outlook, is something that can be attained or can be discussed by the diplomatic channels as well. So why a war? That was it. And this was coming from somebody who was a very high ranking official in the Germany in the German naval, department, and he said that there will be no war. And this was precisely a month before the war started. Okay, so I am highlighting all these things to tell you that Europe never wanted a war. Europe thought that their arrangement of energy trade and all of that, and the diplomatic negotiation and the Normandy format talks. Obviously, there was problem in eastern Ukraine, especially with Donbass, because there is a separatist movement on which is fanned by Russia, and Ukraine, obviously, being that one country wants to have its territorial integrity intact. So there is something which is going on in East Ukraine, and especially the Donbass region. But all I'm trying to say is that the Europeans, and particularly French and Germans, tried their level best to try to find a diplomatic solution to it, which they couldn't. Okay, and then the war happened. So now going back, all these arguments that you hear about Macron saying that NATO was brain dead, etc., all of this comes before the war. You see, if you look at the structure of the European Union has something called the Council of the EU. Right? And council of the head of the Council of the EU is, you can understand it really well. It is something like a G20 presidency, so it keeps rotating. Okay, and whoever comes, and it also works in a troika system, which is that the current, president of that particular body works in close coordination with his predecessor and his successor. It's something like that. And since G20 is the flavor of the season, so it's very easy to make people understand as to how that presidency works. So the president of the EU Council is somebody, and usually when it comes to, if you were to transpose this understanding to European Union, of course it applies to the 27 member states, right? So it's a kind of a rotating presidency of the Council of the EU, and then the country who is in charge of that particular thing works in close coordination with its predecessor and successor and puts together the agenda of the European Union. Okay, so that is why it is important. And Macron, when France became the president of the Council of the EU, they came up with extremely important, I would say, decisions for where European Union should be headed as a bloc. And one of the core things out there was to put together what it takes to achieve more strategic autonomy. And what is strategic autonomy? Strategic autonomy basically means the ability to take decisions for yourself. And why could EU not take decisions for itself? Because it was only functioning as an economic bloc. Whenever it came to hard security issues, they knew that they would have to, go back to NATO or the US. And because there was no war in Europe for a very long time, Georgian war was looked upon as a very localized war. 2014 Crimea was treated as an exception. So nothing happened, that could match the degree of what is happening right now. So before Ukraine happened, the idea was that, see, a big war is never going to return to Europe. It doesn't make any sense, okay, for us to be so dependent on NATO. Why are we so dependent on NATO? And if you want to talk about what was happening in NATO was becoming extremely irrelevant because Trump, in fact, went to the extent of saying that why do we need a NATO at all? I mean, look at Europeans; they are doing the trade with China. When it comes to trade, they want to trade with China. When it comes to having energy, they are buying energy from Russia. But when it comes to taking responsibility for the security, they suddenly want us. We don't want to. That was the classic Trumpian withdrawal, okay, from almost all these multilateral platforms. So NATO was already becoming very irrelevant to a Europe where there was no concern for a conventional war. Okay, small little wars will keep happening. There are different state apparatus to deal with them, right? But you don't. We are talking about a conventional proper war. Okay, something to the effect of the world wars. Okay, or something like that. So Europe had this belief, I would say, that war is not going to return to the European continent. Why do we need a NATO? And that is where you understand why Macron said statements like NATO being brain dead, etc. So it just showed that you don't really are not as dependent, and you would like to have your strategic autonomy yourself. And in fact, if you ask me what is the document within the European Union that actually takes that into account and wants to sort of do something about completing that incomplete project, okay, that security leg, okay, because you only have the economy leg in the EU. So that one document that really took I would say did a deeper analysis of what Europe should do, how Europe should go about having this strategic autonomy, is a document called the Strategic Compass. And Macron's presidency, French presidency of the European Council, was extremely instrumental in putting this together. And if you go into the details of Strategic Compass talks about Europe not only as a geo-economic or a power or an economic, super heavyweight. It also talks about Europe as an actor that has a global security outreach, that can really operate as a global security provider. Okay, so somewhere they want to raise the stature and say, see, the European Union experiment it was never only about economy. It was just that so far, since we had outsourced all this to NATO, so we wanted NATO, but now I think we can take care of ourselves. And, we have this understanding of strategic autonomy. We are an important bloc. We can't really we can't go on being pushed around by great powers. We need to have our own say, but we cannot have it until we have the security leg in place. And which is that one thing that really does that? It is the strategic compass. So that was where Europe was going. Okay, and then lo and behold, there comes the war, and everything goes out of the window because Europe realizes that we can't really, we have everything as a potential, but today if there is a war, there is nothing that can allow us, okay, or that can enable the delivery of weapons. We can't do it. We can't produce ammunitions, okay. All of that, they were suddenly dependent on the NATO. And this NATO, which was losing relevance in the larger European context, okay, even though it had expanded, and even though it had an Article 5, but the day-to-day importance, the overwhelming sense of somebody as the major security provider that NATO has now, okay, that was nowhere in picture. And suddenly Europe realized how paralyzed they are when it comes to actually trying to achieve the strategic autonomy on the ground, because the ground reality, actually, if there is a conventional war, Europe does not have the ability to do it. And therefore, after the Russia-Ukraine war, one very clear understanding and realization within Europe is that, look, we are going to work towards strategic autonomy because the cost of everything is such, Mehraj, that even the US wants the EU to be more independent. Okay, and this is a point which is not very well understood, because you would argue that Europe would never want EU to become more independent. That's not what it is. So if you look at what is the thinking in the security architecture or the emerging security architecture, the emerging security architecture, the two major characteristics or the two fundamental verticals along which Europe is trying to come up with a security architecture is one, deepening ties with NATO and the transatlantic alliance, which is like unquestionable. Like I said, even if you look at Macron's own domestic policies about anything that you pick up about that has the national security, related to national security or military strategy, you will see that one common theme out there is deepening ties with NATO. There is no question about it, okay? But the change is that uh, despite the all this deepening of ties with NATO is only one side of the thing. The second is that they have to develop their own strategic autonomy. And what the Europeans have done is that the Europeans have come up finally, because there are 27 countries, it's not just one country. They have come up with certain structure about how to parallelly develop, one, deepening ties with NATO and the US, and two, striving for their strategic autonomy. They have certain tools. I'll talk to you about it later. They have lots of tools to do it. They have new strategies to do it. They have new formulas for doing it. My only problem is that how do you blend? Well, it is meant to be complementing each other. So the idea is that the transatlantic dependence should be complementing to NATO, to EU's quest for strategic autonomy. The problem is, because you are talking about independence and dependence in the same breath, it is going to intersect at a time. It is counterintuitive to imagine that this is not mutually exclusive. So how well will Europe do it is something that only time can tell. But right now, I can definitely tell you for sure, because in fact, I was invited to Brussels for the flagship European Union, security dialogue about how to bring about a new security order, a new security architecture. So I can tell you firsthand what Joseph Borrell had to say, what was the sentiment at the EU Parliament, what did the French, people, the French contingent had to say, what were others saying about it. So I was a part of it, and we, there. So I can definitely tell you with a lot of confidence and validity is that the dependence on NATO or the deepening of transatlantic ties is not going anywhere, simply because of the fact that Europe understands that in case of a conventional war that they wished never happened, but since it has happened, the case of a conventional war, they do not have security guarantees. And right now, they are not in a position to actually fend for their security. Whether they'll be able to get there in due course is something that they want and they are working towards. But will that come? And there will come a time when they'll say that bye-bye NATO, we don't want you. I don't know. But for even to get there, I think it's a really long way to go, because conventional warfare, conventional weapons, the tanks, the ammunition production, supply chains, etc., they are only for the first ever time. They are starting with it now. Training, military training, all of that, interoperable systems, all Europe has been doing in certain countries in Europe is to make those weapons and sell it off. Okay, but to actually have their own militaries train with it, okay, to have the joint exercises, to have that kind of interoperable or joint air defense. Now, this is something that they're very, very far from. If you take out NATO from the picture, they are just extremely vulnerable. Okay, so that is where it is going. If I just, because it was a very long intervention from me, so if I just want to basically conclude what I've been saying is that the quest for strategic autonomy is not something which is new. This particular quest for strategic autonomy really became more crystallized and focused when France took up the presidency of the Council of the EU. And then the best document that EU has to guide as to what that security or autonomy means is the strategic compass. And that was also the time when NATO was by and large losing relevance, okay, in Europe, because A, of America's policies under Trump, and B, because there was no war. But all of that, went out of the window when the war started. And therefore, a post-war realization in Europe is that you have to work on your security architecture along two verticals, one, deepening ties with NATO. And there are certain things that I can tell you that the latest, like January 2023 EU-NATO declaration, they have an administrative agreement. There is a lot of things actually, okay? And striving for strategic autonomy. And for that, they have their own formulas. They are coming out with new strategies, the new space strategy. They have the new hybrid toolbox. They have lots of other things. But even now, the things is not the debate is not complete, because what Europe is now doing, and I'll tell you in a very, very simple manner, I think your audience are all students and people who are working, I mean researchers on IR, so I'm sure everybody has heard about securitization theory, okay? And the securitization theory and the securitization debate of the Copenhagen School. And one of the most fundamental takeaways of the Copenhagen School, Mehraj, if you remember, was that security and the security threats and concerns are basically broad spectrum, right? You have to link security issues, right? So you, just by saying that you have military security is only half the story. Valid. But if you want to make it holistic, you have to talk about environmental security, climate security, food security, the emerging threat, artificial intelligence, etc. And especially the second generation Copenhagen theorists actually talk about it, AI domains and all the critical intelligence, etc. So one of the arguments that I recently made in a paper, which will be out very soon, and I would love to share it with you all. It's a technical paper, it's a research paper, which is that despite sitting on the wealth of the Copenhagen School and the securitization debate, Europe still, all these years, has been committing a mistake about keeping the securities in silos. Okay, so traditional security looked upon by somebody else, economic security looked upon by somebody else, economic policies, it's a different department. Because of treating these things in silos is why Europe is at a position that it is today. And how they want to deal with it is that they have to relink those security issues. So just by saying strategic autonomy or deepening ties with NATO, the story is still not complete. And just the last point is, how will the story become complete? The story will become complete when Europe comes up with a common strategy towards China. Why is that important? Because Europe is not just dependent on China for its trade. Of course, they have billions of dollars of trade. Europe is also dependent on China because of critical rare earth elements, okay? And that is something which is extremely important, the chips and all the, for the batteries, even if they want to make a climate transition, I mean, after all this, they want to make green transitions, where is all the lithium for the batteries going to come from, okay? So all of that. Now, recently they made discoveries that there are massive reserves of rare earths in Sweden, but they still do not have the supply chains, the production chains, ready for it. So because we're living in a complex world, the smart thing that Europe needs to do after blending traditional security with strategic autonomy, the third thing that they need to do, which is the elephant in the room, is trying to come up with a unified approach towards China. And because Macron messed it up that way, I mean, in that particular respect, Macron messed it up. And that is why it became such an issue, because he somehow went to China and said that, look, I don't have a problem with you. It's basically US and it's basically the rest of the, Europe that has a problem. I mean, I don't have a problem. I don't want to get involved in Taiwan. I don't want to do that. And that became a mess, because if you carefully understand, not only that Macron's policies are not like that, but if they really wish to link their security issues, they cannot do it without having a unified approach towards China. And one of the ways in which this unified approach is being talked about is what Ursula von der Leyen announced, I think just a week or a few days before she joined Macron for the trip to Europe, which is known as the de-risking strategy, which is considered to be more realistic than decoupling. Because everybody understands that the kind of dependence and economic dependence that countries have on China, you cannot talk about decoupling. That would hurt you more, okay? So how do you then blend that concern with the concern for China's trade practices, etc., is to you try to de-risk. What do you do when you de-risk? You try to cut off China from sensitive tech. You try to cut off the coercive economic practices of China. So EU has been coming up with a anti-coercion instrument for the same. Now, just the last thing is that how well will it really shape, okay, in a way to make a difference? Again, these are things that time will tell, because we are talking about a Europe that is having a lot of economic problems because of this very expensive war that they are supporting Ukraine to fight. Because it's not just the weapons, just the weapons don't cost much because those weapons were only coming from the shelves. Okay. Those were weapons that the Western allies were not using, and they just sent it to Ukraine. That's all. The money is going into this massive humanitarian aid. The money is going to go in this massive rebuilding of Ukraine. They're losing money because of high energy prices. They're losing money because overnight Europe had to find out a network of getting energy from other sources and not Russia. So all the LNG terminals and all the money that went there, all the economic cost of the oil bans and the price cap. So nothing, there are no free lunches. They were dependent on Russia because of a reason, because everything was so cost efficient. Now, because they had to diversify almost in an overnight manner, in a very, very, I would say, emergent manner, all of it has come up with a cost. The production costs have risen within Europe, and that is why you see a lot of major industries are shifting their production bases to China. Right now, these are questions that they need to answer, and none of this will work in the long term, not in the short term. None of this is going to work without having a unified approach to try and de-risk trade with China and not decouple. Decoupling is not going to happen, neither for the US, nor for India, nor for anybody else, because China is a major manufacturing giant, and we are like, we can buy less from China, but what do we do? I mean, I'm talking about India, just giving an example. What do we do about the APIs? Right? We are so dependent. So those are the critical things that, for if you want to make resilient supply chains for it, those things are not going to come in a year or two. You're going to take a decade to do that. So the point is to try and not bring about a global economic catastrophe because of all this, and try to de-risk. And if you ask me, yes, Europe is doing a lot of brainstorming about how that de-risking should be. In fact, if you closely see, after the de-risking thing has come up because of Ursula von der Leyen, you see that the US is also towing that line. And, Antony Blinken said that even we would like to de-risk and not decouple, because decoupling perhaps was just the wrong semantics. Nobody can decouple really. So that is where it is going. And it is the right beginning, because yes, these are things that are extremely important if you want to have a holistic connected view of your security threats and solutions. But at the same time, since you were so late, I mean, you're a late bloomer in so many ways, so you really have to put up a tough front. And therein, the statements made by Macron, etc., are not really taken up very well within Europe. And just days after Macron went there, the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she's quite I would say, she speaks her mind all the time. So she's a very powerful woman leader in Europe today. And Annalena Baerbock said that, look, we are also a big economic power. We are also dependent on China. Our leader also went to China for a lot of deals, but we did not say these really mindless things. So I'm going to go and do the damage control. And days after Macron's visit, she went there again. So the point again was, I mean, obviously she didn't do anything great. The point was that China should not think that there is some sort of an internal wedge. Of course, we are a democratic bloc, and people would have, and this is something that I also argued in my piece, which is that, see, it is at the core, it is always good to have a society which is thinking and debating and contemplating. Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with that. And the strategic autonomy will come. But to place it in a way where you start to appear very weak or very divided at a time when you need that solidarity is not a good thing. Okay. So I mean, that's what France also has to say about it. And then, you would see that a lot of people and analysis that started coming from France said that, look, we understand this very well. Strategic autonomy is something that we've been trying to pursue after the Second World War itself. It's not anything new. But yes, does it mean any policy changes in our policy towards NATO, or in our policies towards the US, or our policies towards, say, for example, supporting Ukraine? No, none of that. In fact, this probably will be the last thing that I say, and we can move on to something else. Just as we talk right now, the European Union, and by the way, France is a member there, European Union has come up with a second round, okay, of producing ammunition and sending it to Ukraine. And this was something which was unthinkable before the war. So if they're doing all of this, it definitely means that it's very little changes on the ground. But if you want to understand the scent in the air, you should know where things will be going. And therein, you have to understand and deep